Wuxi Pharmatech went public
Right.
last year. It was a huge deal,
Right.
kind of the coming out for the China biotech.
Right.
And Wuxi Pharmatech is I guess, the market leader of the whole Chinese CRO industry, which has
That's right.
now perhaps more than 100 CRO companies. So, you know, as an investor trying to look ahead, is CRO still where the place to be now, or is it evolving, transforming from this point forward? And what are you working on, looking at?
Right. Well, I think that as an investment opportunity, the CRO opportunity is probably past us. There may be opportunities to invest in very, very targeted, very specialized CROs if one can identify a particular technology area that is not properly served by the existing CROs. So there may be some opportunities. But I think that certainly the big wins in that space for investors have probably all been had. So at this point, I know that I have already, as of a couple of years ago, begun to set my aim elsewhere. Last year, I was involved in co-founding a company called LEAD Therapeutics,
Right.
which I think represents the next generation of Chinese biotechnology companies. It's actually not a biotech company per se, it's a pharmaceutical company based more on traditional chemistry approaches than biotech per se. But it's the same business model. And LEAD Therapeutics is what some people call a hybrid company. It has a corporate headquarters here in the US and a core management team based in the US, but all of its operations, all of its R&D, and part of its management are based in China. And some people get confused, but LEAD is not a service company. It looks in some ways like some of the CROs, but the goal of LEAD is to develop new drugs for its own account. In other words, right. to own those drugs, either to bring them to market or to partner them with larger pharmaceutical companies. And so, so even by mid '07, we had already moved on to that kind of model. We are now looking at companies that are really wholly based in China as a potential opportunity.
Speaking of that, so you've been traveling around in China as I understand. So are you looking still focusing on Beijing and Shanghai, or are you opening up to the secondary cities as well? I understand you were in Dalian and Hangzhou, and
right.
I know Suzhou has a pretty aggressive park.
Right. Right. So I have definitely done some scouting and some tire kicking. I want to put this question in perspective, because this is a question that is implicit in a lot of what's going on in China. Many of the cities and regions in China are investing very heavily in trying to create technology clusters and biotechnology clusters. They're building these beautiful industrial parks. They're pouring money into trying to attract people like us to invest there and to put our companies there. Well, let's look at the history in the US for perspective. The US has had massive, hundreds of billions of dollars invested by the government and by the private sector in life sciences since the 1950s, and really, really accelerating with the war on cancer beginning around 1970. Right? So even with that long history of investment and drawing on the talent pool from almost 200 world-class medical research institutions in the US, the US only has 3 science clusters only 3 life sciences clusters that you can say are really at critical mass. That's San Francisco Bay Area, San Diego, and Boston. And then there are other sites where there are some concentrations of activity. Big pharma is concentrated in New Jersey and down the Beltway toward Bethesda. And so there have been some biotech companies sprouting up around there. There's a small cluster in Texas. There are a lot of cancer-oriented companies in Seattle, a lot of medical device companies in Minnesota. But the reality is that we only have 3 major self-sustaining life sciences clusters in the US. So I think it is really unrealistic to expect that China, certainly in the short or medium term, is going to surpass that. There simply aren't enough good people, and there simply isn't enough money to build 10, let alone 50 world-class clusters in China or anywhere.
Right.
So, yes, we are kicking the tires. We're going around and looking, but I think the reality is that most of the really interesting companies are either going to be started up in established centers like Shanghai, or they're going to have to move some of their locations there, or have some kind of corporate presence there if they want to really take advantage of the best resources that China has to offer. Now, you mentioned Suzhou, Tianjin. I think Suzhou started off in some senses trying to compete with Shanghai, but I think that they've really settled into a role as more a satellite of Shanghai. The irony is that while Western companies have been going to China to save on costs in part, companies in Shanghai are finding their cost structures have been going up, and so they're moving a lot of their manufacturing operations to Suzhou. So rather than competing with each other, I think Suzhou and Shanghai are now actually forming sort of a super cluster.
Right.
And Tianjin may end up serving a similar function to Beijing. It remains to be seen. But the likelihood of a completely independent cluster starting up somewhere in the interior, I think, is really remote.
But they don't have to. They don't have to be individual comprehensive clusters. They can be their hybrid on their own. Like LEAD, you have the headquarters here in San Francisco. Operations in China, they can have their more centralized location in Shanghai with their resources elsewhere, like the satellite.
Yes, there's no question. And some companies, for example, have set up their preclinical research operations in Sichuan province or in Yunnan province, where there is some existing infrastructure for that, and where the costs are much lower. But I think this is part of a general worldwide trend toward businesses really being multi-sourced and having multiple locations and so on. So that's not something particular to China, one way or another. But I think realistically that Shanghai is so far in the lead in terms of establishing a viable and sustainable cluster of critical mass that it is going to continue. It's going to be like the Bay Area is. It's going to be the equivalent to the Bay Area in China as being a primary center.